Charles Chesnutt was one of the most influential African American writers of the 19th century. He was often compared to other classic contemporary authors like Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, and Frederick Douglass, yet his works are hardly ever taught about in schools. Chestnut wrote many essays and novels, two of his most popular being The Mirror of Tradition, which is a short story collection published in 1901, and The Conjure Woman, which is another short story collection, of which excerpts such as The Gifford Grapevine were published in newspapers across the East Coast of the United States. They were published in lots of different magazines, like the Saturday Evening Gazette and the Cambridge Tribune, and in class, we read the excerpt through the Atlantic's August 1877 issue, where the story remains preserved over a century later. I'd like to make a point to read more novels and fiction written by African Americans of the 19th century, because for a really long time, the only media I was taught that they had written were various slave narratives, and until high school, actually, I don't think I ever heard of white British contemporary writers during that time period, and hadn't really gotten to hear about a lot of African American voices. Charles Chesnutt and many other writers were almost erased from history, and a lot of their works were often forgotten, which is why I believe it's really important for preservation attempts to be made, such as the chestnutarchive.org, which is where I found a lot of his works. Now, Chestnut has a very distinct writing style, and by delivering many of his stories from the perspective of a white-sounding narrator, the stories would not initially receive as much racial bias or backlash from the white audiences, because whites were more likely to support a white narrator's perspective in fiction and nonfiction, because they could, see themselves in the narrator. Now, the use of fiction for conveying beliefs on real-world issues is nothing new, but the way Chestnut delivers his beliefs gently, almost compelling his audience to believe his writing is just lighthearted and based on personal anecdotes, leaves them to contemplate the deeper meanings of the story themselves. And that really astounds me. Chestnut uses something called narrative imagination, which was actually termed by American philosopher Martha Nussbaum in her essay of the same name. And it roughly means, quote, the ability to be an intelligent reader of another person's story. Chestnut understood that white audiences might not be on the same page with African American narratives and the stories of freed slaves because of a lot of religious disparity and a lot of just societal differences. So, by employing a white narrator and putting himself in the shoes of his white audiences, he's able to gain a lot of control over his audience, and he can make palatable to Southerners even abolitionist beliefs, which I thought was really cool and really interesting, because I know a lot of contemporary writers focused more on their beliefs and just set that in stone and kind of forcefully push that onto their audience rather than adapting to what the audience thought. So, in a review of Chestnut's writing for the Mississippi Quarterly, which was a quarterly magazine at the time in the 1960s, Julian D. Mason writes that, quote, Chestnut may have remained in the South if it had been possible to receive there the things which his soul, mind, and talent needed. For even with an Ohio address, he never forgot or wanted to forget all the South taught him, and he wanted to use both its good and bad lessons for the betterment of mankind. And that was Mason, page 79. Through his writing, Chestnut tried to convey a sense of relatability and almost peacefulness within it to both sides of the equation. Above all else, I believe Chestnut wanted his readers to walk away with a sense of, understanding with the characters in his stories, and with a sense of almost relativity, almost relatability. Because I believe that Chestnut knew if both sides could empathize with each other, that his audience would be able to have civil discussions and to talk to each other, and that way they'd be brought together. Both Chestnut and Nussbaum prioritized connecting to broader audiences in their writing, and they both believed that the act of storytelling was really important to every individual's journey to better citizenship. And although many decades and genres apart, Chestnut's a fiction writer, Nussbaum's a philosopher, I believe they shared a lot of the same beliefs. And in my Thorn Wright's article in Nussbaum's Philosophy, He writes that, quote, "It is not information or knowledge that binds people from different groups together, but love and compassion," unquote, which I believe that Chestnut would support wholeheartedly. Most of his writing showed both sides of any situation he came across, and he tried to reach out empathetically to each side of the discussion to make sure that everyone understood his writing was for equality. And it really surprised me how eloquently Chestnut wrote, as I had previously been told for some reason, which I'm now finding out is not true, and I'm not sure where my teachers at the time had given me this information from. But I had previously been told that it was still illegal for freed slaves to seek education at public universities and to be published as a whole. And because of this, I believe that many would struggle with creating work of this caliber. And obviously now I've learned that that is not the case, because viewing Chestnut's work and viewing the work of others has really enlightened me on that subject, and I was really surprised. Chestnut's use of narrative imagination really proved to me that that assumption was completely baseless. I was also led to believe that no African American at the time was allowed to be published. I don't understand why. And if their works were, they were not usually acknowledged by the public, which I now understand the public at the time was just the majority white population. And while that may be true, when reading over Chestnut's works, I realized that even though they were published, he was more likely forced or pressured to write them in a manner pleasurable to the white folks rather than truly choosing to do it of his own style.